Ridgeway First Selectman of Cornwall. Welcome everyone to our FOI information meeting. We are, I know there are people from other towns who have asked to join us, and they're certainly welcome to come, as is everyone from the public. This is sort of a new format. We have had freedom information meetings before with Tom Hennick, who does an excellent job, and I find I always learn new things from him when he presents. But I think part of the reason we're doing this is because some things have changed in the age of remote meetings, and a lot of things have stayed the same. So what we're trying to do is go over public meetings, how they're run, what the legal requirements are. And Tom's going to talk about the Freedom of Information Act, which is an important part of public meetings. And then we are also welcoming our town attorney, Pearlie Grimes, to do another presentation about public meeting procedures, specifically about land use boards and how meetings run, and some of the aspects of that. We are going to, so what I'm going to try to do, what I've talked to Tom and Pearlie about, is to have Tom start and do about a half an hour presentation about the Freedom of Information Act and how that applies to town meetings and town boards and town records and transcripts. And then we'll open it up for questions at about 7:30 for about 15 minutes, get a chance for people to ask Tom questions. And then Pearlie will start his presentation at about 7:45, and then again go for about half an hour or even less if he's able to condense things, and then have another opportunity for questions and answers after that. And again, welcome everyone. And we would like, when we get to question and answer, just have everybody ask one question before, we're trying to get as many people's questions answered as possible. So anyway, welcome Tom and Pearlie. These two gentlemen are people I rely on constantly to try to run things properly for our town. They're veteran of this business of municipal government and how does it work. And again, thank them both for taking time to make these presentations. And we're doing this also because we do have some new town officials, and we have veteran town officials. But again, we can all learn, especially as COVID and remote meetings have changed some of the requirements and some of the participation rates, which and in my mind have been for the better. So that's enough from me. So I'd like to turn it over to Tom Hennick, Public Information Officer for the Freedom of Information Commission. Tom.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you for the invitation, everybody. Happy to be here. Always would rather do it in person, but a lot of you are out there, so hang with us. On the technology front, however, it's always something. I will probably have to cut out after I answer your questions. I'm back in my office tonight because my computer at home is not responding the way it should. We're having an internet problem in our neighborhood, so I don't know how long they'll let me stay here. I may have to split shortly after we talk, but I'll give you some contact information if we don't get to all your questions. And as Gordon and Pearlie and John will attest, I will call you back. When I'm here during the day, I answer a lot of questions on the phone. I answer a lot of emails, and I'm always happy to do that. And I encourage you to do that. For those of you who don't know me or haven't met me before, you have a face to put with a voice on the other end of the phone. And I'm never afraid to say I don't know if I don't know the answer to a question, but I'll get you an answer, and it'll be something that we hope you can use. And I stress that and also share with you that I am not an attorney. This is not legal advice. This is not an order from the FOI Commission. In my role as the public education officer, I go around the state and do these kinds of workshops. Obviously, less going around in the last 18 months, although I'm starting to go out more. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to Brooklyn. That's in Connecticut, not New York. And so, I say, if you ask me to come out, I'll be happy to do it. So thank you for giving us this opportunity. We do these workshops not to beat you up, not to make you miserable, but to try to help, to try to answer your questions, to try to give you a bigger comfort zone when it comes to freedom of information. Those of you who are in town government or on boards and commissions, many of you probably didn't sign up for this FOI stuff and this ethics stuff and all this. You said, hey, I just want to help my town. I want to help Cornwall. And I know there's some folks from, I think Sharon and Warren around in the room as well. You did it just to try to be good citizens, to try to participate. But then when you got on your board and you went to your first meeting and people started talking about things like FOI and freedom of information, you say, well, what's that all about? Well, that's the law in the state of Connecticut that guides how many of us run our meetings. I should tell you, by the way, that a lot of times when I do these workshops, people say, hey, Tom, you don't get it. We're volunteers. We didn't sign up for this stuff, this FOI stuff and the Roberts rules and all that. Well, I've been a member of a board in my town for a long time too, so I do get it. I was a member of one board for 10 years, the chairman for the last 5. I was a member of the Board of Selectmen for a couple of years, and then now I'm on another board. And I get what it's like to sort of have your life going in one direction, and then you have to be a public official, and you sort of go from one to another, and you gulp down a meal and you run to a meeting. So I get what that's like too. And the boards that I was on and am on have someone who knows a little bit about FOI, so I can sort of guide us. But many times you get on a board, especially after an election when there's been turnover, and you have no how do we do this? What do we do? So that's why sessions like this can be really helpful. I said the word law, and the FOI Act is the law in the state of Connecticut. It's not just some really cool idea. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild, believe it or not, when she ran for governor for the first time. This law is 46 years old. And Ella Grasso was in Congress at the time when she started thinking about running for governor. And if you do the math, 46 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. And you had a country that was in turmoil, a country that was beset with all kinds of problems, many of which were caused by government being conducted in secret. And as Ella was watching all this unfold, she said, one of the things I'm going to do if I'm elected governor is create some sort of an open government law. I'm going to see to it that what I'm watching here in Washington doesn't happen in Connecticut. As you know, she ran, she won, and it's one of the first things she did was put forward this concept of an open government law. And she put it forward with a promise. She said, this law is so important to our state. I will see to it that this law is approved unanimously by our legislature. Now, for those of you on camera, are you smiling? Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote with the legislature? Have you ever watched them? Can you believe it? Well, she guaranteed it, folks, and I'm here to tell you she got it. I've seen a video. There was not a single no vote in the House, not a single no vote in the Senate. This law passed unanimously, which shows you not only how important it was then, how important it remains today, but it also, frankly, gives us some insight as to why we're having these kind of workshops, these kind of discussions. Because to get to the point where everybody voted yes, can you imagine the arm twisting? Can you imagine the conversations? Can you imagine the negotiation over every single little word? And you've got a law that's based on a really simple, easy concept: open government, transparency. But then when you try to read it, have any of you tried to read it? I know Pearlie has, I know Gordon has, John probably has too. Your eyes will roll to the back of your heads, the wherefore, the wherefores, the where it, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what are we supposed to do with all this? Well, that's why we have these conversations, because to get to the point where everybody voted yes, they created this nice law, but they left a lot open to interpretation. They left a lot open to us, those of us who are on the front lines, to say, okay, we got this meeting coming up tonight. How do we notice it? What's the best way to notice it? Should we be in executive session? Is this a record we should withhold? So you have to make those decisions sometimes on the fly. And to be able to do that properly and avoid trouble with the FOI Act, you want to have the tools to work with so that you can do that properly. And that's, that circles back to why we're here tonight. The law, folks, is about two basic things. It's about access to public meetings and access to public records. Tonight, most of you are members of boards and commissions, so we'll focus on the meetings provisions. But if I don't touch on something in the short period we have together, I want you to ask about it. And if we don't get it to it in the questions, again, I want you to call. Maybe this is a good time to throw that number out there for the first time, 566-5682 is the number at the FOI Commission. You call, you ask for me. If you get voicemail, I'm on the phone a lot. I will call you back. 860-566-5682. But we have these conversations. People will call up, and you know, I answered 23 phone calls this morning, or during the course of the day. You know, we've got a problem with this meeting tonight, the agenda. What do you think? Should? So that we're here to try to help. What we want to have happen is we want to have a situation where you look at something and you say, okay, I think I know the best way to handle it, but I'm going to check. I'm going to check with the Freedom of Information Commission to see, just to make sure if we're doing it properly. And that's what we're here to do, to try to help you. Access to meetings and access to records, although you think, wait a minute, it's not called freedom of access, it's called freedom of information. And that's one of the little tricky parts that we always run into. People think it's about free information, don't they? They think it's about asking questions. They come into a meeting and they say, I want to ask you this and I want to ask you that. Freedom of information, I have a right to know. Well, one of the things that we need to remind ourselves is that it's not about answering questions. One of the things that this law doesn't have is a provision that requires people to answer questions when you're on a board or a commission or sitting in a town office. It's about access to the meeting, so people can come and watch you work. They can come and listen to your work and see you in action, or get records that have the information that they're looking for. But technically, we're not required to answer questions. Now, we're public servants. We're going to do that. But there may reach a point where you're saying, you know, I'm not comfortable answering that question. I'm not going to do it. And, you know, again, as a by the way, think about working at the Freedom of Information Commission. People think that we are the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. I spend time, you know, I told you I answer questions. People call up and ask for directions. They ask me to send them records. Constantly, people are asking me to send them records. Please send me this, please send me that. I had a guy call up a couple weeks ago. He says, I need your help. I said, what's the matter? He said, I need a copy of my naturalization papers. I said, what? Your naturalization papers? He says, I said, is that like a federal thing? And he says, yes. I went to them. They were going to charge me $500. I thought you might have an extra copy lying around. You can't make it up. That's not what we do. That's not what the law is about. The Freedom of Information Commission is in place to make sure that all citizens are guaranteed the access that they have a right to meetings and records. And if someone believes they're not getting that access, they come to the Freedom of Information Commission with a complaint, and that ultimately the commission has the right to adjudicate that complaint and say, hey, Cornwall, you were right. You don't have to give out that record, or Cornwall, you were wrong. You misread that exemption, give it out. But that's what it's about. It's not about us providing information. And the same applies to boards and commissions. So access to meetings, access to records. Let me talk to you a little bit about meetings. Let me read you the definition. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So, based on that definition, those of you who are on boards and commissions, the key thing is this: anytime you get together to do your work, your assigned task, your elected task, consider it a meeting and make sure you've noticed it properly, make sure it's open to the public, make sure there are minutes when the meeting is done. A lot of times people will call up and say, hey, you know, we've got a really dicey issue here. Can we get together beforehand informally to talk about it? Well, in the private sector, that would be a great idea, but in the public sector, you can't do that. If a quorum of your board gets together to have that conversation, it's a meeting. Now, there's a couple things we'll talk about in a minute that allow boards and commissions to, you know, sort of exclude the public. But for the most part, the key thing is that you have to do your work in public. Well, gee, Tom, what if we form a little subcommittee? Subcommittee's not the full board. That way we don't have to worry about the whole quorum thing. Well, a subcommittee becomes a public agency unto itself. So if you've got a 10-member board and you form a 3-member subcommittee and say, aha, we don't need to consider it freedom of information, but that's not accurate. The definition of a public agency is long. It applies to many, many things, but it also says including any committee of or created by. So if your board creates a subcommittee, that becomes a separate new public agency and needs to follow the same rules. It's always best to think in terms of doing your work in public that will remove the kinds of issues that you otherwise might have by sort of meeting in secret and having people accuse you of having secret meetings. The law talks to us about three different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. A regular meeting is a meeting that you have per schedule that you put together. Probably by the end of January of every year, it says we meet on the first and third Tuesday, 7 o'clock, library, 8 o'clock, town hall, whatever that is, that becomes your regular meeting schedule. Special meeting is not really all that special. A lot of people see that word special and they say, oh, we can't do that. Special meetings and regular meetings are almost virtually the same, actually. For both of them, you have to prepare agendas at least 24 hours in advance. Now, if any of you are agenda preparers, one of the key things to remember there is that the courts have told us that agendas must fairly apprise the public as to what's going to happen at the meeting. So you want agenda specificity. You want agendas to tell the people what's going on so they can look at it and say, okay, I don't need to go to that meeting, or, oh, gee, I really do need to go to that meeting. The agenda's in 24 hours in advance. The difference between the regular and the special meeting is minimal. Here's the difference. At a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on the agenda, someone can say, Madam Chairman, that's not on the agenda. I'd like to talk about it. I make a motion that we add it. Somebody seconds it. And if 2/3 of those of you who are present and voting vote to add it to the agenda, you can have it added to the agenda at a regular meeting. At a special meeting, you can't do that. So if the meeting does not fall on your regular schedule and it's a special meeting, and we have them all the time, we don't have a quorum, we need to move the meeting, all those things. The only difference is that on a regular meeting where you can add things, at a special meeting, you can't. So for instance, if you're preparing agendas and you use an item like other business or old business or new business, well, it's not a great agenda item, but at a regular meeting, someone can say, Madam Chairman, I'd like to add that under old business. You can vote to do it. But in a special meeting, if there's nothing listed under that item, you can't add it. So if you have old business on there with nothing underneath it, you might as well take it off, because you can't say, is there any old business? The third kind of meeting, briefly, is an emergency meeting. I always discourage boards and commissions from using emergency meetings because they're not noticed. And the bigger issue is that what you and I think might be an emergency might not rise to that level in the eyes of the law, especially those of us who are not legally trained. Now Thursday is Veterans Day, right? And it's a Thursday, but let's just sort of pretend it's a Wednesday. So Veterans Day falls on a Wednesday. Some town halls are open, some town halls are closed. I guarantee you, I will get a phone call, maybe not because it falls on a Friday, you'll see in a minute. Let's say it's on Wednesday. I guarantee you on that Thursday morning, I get a phone call that goes something like this. Tom, we've got a problem. What's the problem? Our regular meeting is tonight, the day after one of those holidays. I always bring the agenda in 24 hours in advance, as I'm supposed to, but I forgot the town hall was closed yesterday for Veterans Day, so I brought it in this morning. Is that okay? Well, it's not okay. It's not 24 hours. Well, then we're just going to have to go ahead and meet anyway, and we're going to call it an emergency meeting. Guys, in our minds, we get the fact that there's a lot to do, and canceling the meeting would be disastrous. But oops, I forgot is not an emergency. In our minds, in our non-legal minds, it might be. So what I always suggest is, look, unless you have a true, genuine emergency, and what's that? It's keeping people safe. It's keeping people out of harm's way. Unless you have that, my suggestion is not to have the meeting, to wait 24 hours and have it as a special meeting. Always be cognizant of the fact that someone could file a complaint. You could do something important, and if the meeting's not properly noticed, someone could file a complaint and ask that the commission invoke one of its strongest powers, which is to declare null and void everything that happens at that meeting. Can you imagine spending a long evening at a meeting approving a site plan if you're P&Z, and then having somebody recognize the fact that the meeting is not properly noticed and put the whole decision-making process in limbo? It's always best to understand that the law is there for a reason. Wait 24 hours and make sure that you've done it properly. Your meetings are open to the public. Now, I'll diverge off of the old script for a second here. Back in July, legislature codified some of the provisions that we've been using during the pandemic. If you need to see it, it's in section 149 of the budget implementer bill, section 21-2 on our website. If you go Freedom of Information Connecticut, go on the website. We've put together what we call I would call it a cheat sheet. We call it a primer. It tells you some of the things that you're required to do that allow you to meet virtually or to have an electronic component of of an in-person meeting. You want to look at some of those things. For example, but the key thing is to make sure that there's real-time live access to your meetings. If you're going to have an electronic component, you need to do that. You need to make sure that you've told the world at least 48 hours in advance that you're going to do that. The agenda requirement is still 24 hours in advance, but 48 hours in advance, you want to say, hey, look, this meeting that we're having, the selectmen's meeting on Wednesday night is going to be Zoom, or it's going to be, a hybrid meeting is what they call it, if it's both in person and virtually. And the key is to make sure that that link, that a Zoom link like you sent me tonight, or however you're going to do it, WebEx or whatever your platform is available to anybody who wants to come in and see the meeting. Some of the other things, the notice, got to make sure that your board members know that there's going to be an electronic provision. You want it on the website. And then if you're in a situation where you're going to have that virtual meeting, you need to make sure that you record it. And you need to make sure that the recording is available for at least 45 days after the meeting. Those are just some of the things that are involved. But if you want to dig into it or ask questions afterwards, we can dig into it together as to some of the things there are. One of the things that has happened with the virtual meetings is, there's been pluses and minuses. Some of the pluses include more people, more participation, and that's created an issue for public speaking. And I think Pearlie will talk about that in depth. But understand, folks, that the Freedom of Information Act does not give anybody the right to speak at a public meeting. A lot of people say, well, I wanted to come in, but he muted me, or I sent him an email and I wanted him to read it. Nothing in the FOI Act requires that kind of participation. So the public speaking portion is in the hands of the board or the commission, and it can handle it as it so chooses. Now, we can have arguments about what's proper and what's, in the spirit of the Constitution and all those things. But from a freedom of information standpoint, if the board stands up at the beginning of the meeting and says, we're not going to have public comment tonight, there's nothing in the FOI Act that violates that calls that a violation. Just so that you're aware of that, because the public speaking issues with meeting this way, the way we're meeting tonight, have popped up a bunch. Another issue that's popped up, I know, maybe show a hand or nod a head. Have you had any problems with Zoom bombing in your towns? You know what I'm talking about when I say that, right? That's one of the reasons that the safeguards with muting, and some towns have had to go to passwords to get people in, and that gets a little dicey because technically you're not supposed to ask anybody who they are and why they're entering a meeting. But for security reasons, that's happened some. I'll tell you, I've had one Zoom bomb experience. I was doing a session like this for a group. This is back in the beginning, and it was a group of activists. It wasn't necessarily people who were on boards and commissions. And I'm talking to them like this, and all of a sudden the screen goes black, and this music, this sort of reggae music, goes on. Now, I was at home at the time, and my daughter was teaching her first graders in my dining room, and I immediately thought that was her class music going on. And then she yells up the stairs. She says, "Dad, what's all that music?" And then I realized that it wasn't her. So the screen is black, and the reggae music comes on, and the strippers parade across in front of the screen. And I'm thinking, oh, well, that's certainly not freedom of information. Folks, would I tell you they didn't leave much to the imagination? They certainly didn't. Fortunately, that was a funny Zoom bomb, if you will. Some of them have not been funny. There have been people yelling racial epithets, calling people names, things like that. And you don't have to stand for that. You have a right to run your meetings and get your work done. So if that ever comes up, do what you need to do to shut that down. And there are provisions in here that allow that to happen. It allows it to happen when you're in person, but also when you're meeting virtually. So I mentioned before that there's a couple ways that boards and commissions can exclude the public. I'm assuming we've all heard about executive session. We know what that is. Folks, remember that an executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It's not something that sits on an island by itself. It's a publicly noticed open meeting. So even if you've got a meeting that's one issue, executive session only, you need to put it on the agenda, executive session planned for the discussion of, and there's 5 reasons for an executive session. And you need to meet in public. Somebody needs to make a motion. You need to go into executive session, having voted 2/3 again needed to do that. You go in, you have a discussion, and then come out. Remember, never, ever make a decision behind closed doors. Always have a conversation, talk as long as you want, but any vote must be public. All votes must be public and must be recorded in the minutes. The 5 reasons for an executive session: a personnel matter, pending claims or pending litigation, a security matter, a property transaction. You're on a board that's looking to build a new police station or a new school, and you're negotiating with landowners to try to buy the property. You wouldn't have to have those negotiations in public. 5th one is a bit of a catch-all. It allows a board or commission to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. A great example would be a board that puts a project out to bid. There's an exemption in the FOI Act that allows a board or commission to withhold the contents of bids until you've actually signed the contract. So you put the project out to bid, the bids come in, they are documents that are temporarily exempt from disclosure. You could vote to go into executive session to talk about the content of those bids. Let me back up to the personnel executive session for just a minute. First of all, executive session personnel, you want more than that on your agendas. The courts have come down very hard on that. Executive session, discussion of the performance of a police officer, of a public works employee, of a teacher. You don't necessarily have to name the person, but you must have more than just personnel. Then you have to remember that if you're going to have a personnel executive session, you want to make sure that the person's been notified in advance. That person then has the right to come forward to your meeting and say, no, wait a minute. I don't want that in executive session. I want that to be done publicly. And if the person demands a public airing of whatever the discussion is, it must be in public. However, once the person waives that right to a public airing, the board has a choice. It can invite the person in, it cannot invite the person in. It's entirely up to the board. So it's up to you folks in a situation like that. But the person often thinks that, hey, they're going to talk about me, I have a right to be in the room. Not necessarily. Once you waive that right to have it done in front of everybody, it's up to the board whether you go into executive session. Remember, never ever vote behind closed doors. And always remember that you want to make sure that your actions, your votes are in public so that everybody can see them and they're recorded in public. In addition to executive session, there's a path that boards can go down. It's a little bit confusing because what the legislature did was carve out several situations where you and I think it might be a meeting. It feels like a meeting. It sure sounds like a meeting. But for the purposes of freedom of information, it's not a meeting. Collective bargaining, not a meeting under FOI. Executive level search committees. If you've ever done one of those, you know, you're looking for a new police chief or superintendent of schools or public works foreman, an important position. You form a committee. The committee can meet outside of freedom of information. There's some logic to that one. If you think about it, you're probably looking for the best possible candidates, which means that some of the candidates will be people who already have jobs and don't want their current employers to know that they're looking. So you could do that behind closed doors. Here's one that I get a kick out of. You can have a social or chance meeting, neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing official business. If members of a board or commission go out to dinner together, what in God's name else are they going to be talking about? Am I right? Here, my advice is always this. Look, let's not be naive. Let's be realistic. These kinds of conversations are going to happen, but avoid the deep, deliberative conversations that you should be having at the table. I guarantee you the one time that you slip and you get into a passionate debate over dinner, the wrong person sitting at the next table and files a complaint that you've just had an illegal secret meeting. Avoid that. Do not set your budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Be smart the extent to which you have those kinds of conversations. And to that end, folks, remember that the definition of a meeting says whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, especially in the last 18 months or so when we communicate, we haven't seen each other as much. We're emailing, we're texting, we're having those kinds of conversations. If you have email exchanges and you're doing business that way, be careful. Those emails become public records. People could ask to see them, and it could become obvious not only what you're thinking and what you're doing, but it could be obvious that you're having a meeting via email, which would be highly illegal. You want to avoid doing that. That's a major no-no. And again, think about how we've been processing things lately. That's how we've been doing business. And to that end, I want to, again, I'm mindful of the time. I'm gonna cut off for questions now, but you said, well, those emails, I was working at home or I was using my own personal laptop. It doesn't matter. When you create a record that has to do with town business, when you do something in connection with your board, your commission, with the town, doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing it falls under the definition of a public record. Now, there are exemptions and exclusions and all those kinds of things. The record might be a record you're allowed to withhold, but for the purposes of thinking in these terms, remember that everything becomes a public record, and you want to be really careful the extent to which you have those kinds of communications. It could put you in a situation where the records are forced out and they become records that you're not comfortable being out there. But the bottom line is, if they're out there, if you've created them, they become public records. The idea that you could, well, it was personal, was it? You don't want to assume anything. You want to look at the exemptions, perhaps, but you want to be very specific and smart. The extent to which you think before you write, think before you send. I took a phone call a couple weeks ago from a woman. She says, "Hi, my name is Sean." I said, "Hi, Sean, how are you?" She said, "Fine." She said, "I'm calling you from Georgia." Georgia? Who's calling Connecticut FOI from Georgia? She says, "Yeah, my husband is an out-of-state contractor and he did a job in Connecticut last summer. And I think he had an affair with a state worker." Why is she calling me? It wasn't me, right? She's calling me because she wants to see that state worker's emails. And she wants to see that state worker's text messages and phone messages. Oh, well, if there's an email in there that says something like, "Meet me at the construction trailer at 6:00. We'll review the blueprints for the project." And then, that's a public record. She said, "Good, it'll help me with my divorce." So think before you write and think before you send. Gordon and Pearlie, I'm looking at the clock. My half hour is up. Fire away with the questions, folks.
Okay, Anna? Oh, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
My question is about draft documents.
Yeah.
If a planning and zoning commission is working on a regulatory amendment and they're working through several different versions, are those subject to FOI requests?
They're subject to them on a yes and no basis, Anna, and I'm not trying to be funny. When they're truly preliminary in nature and you're clearly working on them and you are the drafters, there's a very clear exemption, 1-210B1 for drafts. The problem becomes that some people, when it comes down to crossing a few T's and dotting a few I's, still call it a draft, and it really isn't. It's clearly the foundation for the very next step and probably should be released. But some of those preliminaries, those very early ones, would fall under the draft exemption and not be released. I always suggest to folks that they let their conscience be their guides. If it's not going to be revised much more than a crossed T or a dotted I, then it's probably not a draft anymore. But yes, that exemption exists. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Good.
Jill? Drew?
Yeah, thank you. So if I'm asking a question about what actually constitutes a subcommittee.
Right.
So let's say you have a board of 10 people, and one of the things you want to do is explore a technology system you think the board might want to purchase. Can two people go and talk to look at different technologies and come back to the board at the next meeting with a report on what they found?
Jill, I would say that's fine. I would say if they're not empowered to, start making decisions and spending money, it's probably not a formal subcommittee. So that kind of research and that kind of legwork would be okay, and you wouldn't have to worry about noticing a meeting and having half the town go with them to the various vendors. Pearlie, do you agree with that one? Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Donna Hayes?
Hi, thanks. I actually have two questions. One is, if you're taking notes during a meeting, whether the notes are being taken either by a commission member or the clerk of the board, can those notes be requested as part, can they be FOI'd?
There is an exemption for personal notes. It's actually under the same umbrella that we were talking about with drafts with Anna. If they're the notes of the clerk and they are made for creating the minutes, there's a chance that those might be subject to it. But if there are board members' minutes, notes taken at the meeting, I would say no. And 9 times out of 10, the clerk's notes wouldn't be subject to disclosure either.
Okay. And the other question was, if the secretary of the board uses their own phone to record a meeting, is that FOIable?
That's a great question. The answer would be no.
No.
If you're using town equipment, the answer is yes. But if you're using your own equipment as a clerk, we've had cases where we said absolutely not. It's your personal device. They're your personal notes. You don't need to make that public.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tom.
You're welcome. Is that Joanne? Do you have a question? You need to unmute, Joanne. There we go.
Thank you. May I say, Tom, that I've always found anytime I've called you, you've been very helpful, so thank you.
You're welcome.
I wondered do meetings have to be run according to Robert's Rules of Order?
That would be an in-town decision, Joanne. That's not anything that the FOI Commission would have any jurisdiction over. We get questions on that. We sometimes get complaints on that, but we have no jurisdiction. So there would really be a local decision.
Okay, let me ask you one other follow-up question.
Sure.
One of the things is that certainly the FOI law has changed considerably from Ella Grasso's time. So we as citizens, what would be the one thing you would suggest we write to our legislators about that you'd like to see reinstituted in the FOI law?
Reinstituted. Well, I'll tell you, one of the problems is that every year somebody throws out a proposed exemption to disclosure for different records. And oh, it's not too bad, it's not little, but when they all add up, it's like, chips in the wall. So maybe what you might want to do is have the legislature make sure that there's a full consultation with the FOI Commission before they put in any exemption. That would be one thing. And another thing, frankly, is that the Supreme Court made a ruling this year that we find very disturbing. And it narrowed, when people would ask questions about meetings, we used to say, even if it's not a quorum, it could be a meeting. But the court narrowed that significantly this past March. And it's pretty clear that unless that gathering of a non-quorum gathering, if you will, is a designated subcommittee, it's not a meeting. And we have visions of the people, and I've gotten multiple calls. Well, let's see, if we only have 2 of it, those kinds of conversations indicate that a real problem. So if you wanted to have something changed back, make it clear that even absent a quorum, the board could be having a meeting. That would be another one.
Thank you.
You're welcome. looks like Jill has another question.
Just if nobody else does,
Okay,
just to follow up on what you just said about whether it's a quorum or not. We've had some issues because we send like a question out or like send minutes out to the board in an email, and then somebody responds to that email with a reply all about something that they would like the chair to be aware of. So my understanding is if I send out, say, the draft minutes and
Mhm.
somebody writes to me, just me, and says you got my name wrong, maybe that shouldn't even happen. Maybe all of that should happen in a public meeting. But when they hit reply all, that constitutes a meeting outside a meeting.
that's something that it's good to clarify. Somebody sends something out, a board chair sends something out for everybody to read, to look at. That's not a problem. The board member writes back and says, you spelled my name wrong. That's probably not a problem. But then when some others jump in and say, no, his name is right, no, yeah, and start, or a better example would be the chairman sends something out before a meeting and says, look, folks, I want you all to read this. I feel very strongly that this is what we should do going forward. Probably okay, dissemination of information. Somebody writes back and says, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then somebody else jumps in, and then you're that when the discussion starts rolling forward as a deliberation, that's when it's an issue. I think something simple, like you spelled such and such wrong in the minutes, I wouldn't worry about that. But when someone writes back and says, that's not what I said, we need to change that. And then someone else jumps in and says, oh, that is what you said. By the way, I didn't talk about minutes. Minutes, folks, need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word that everybody says. They should be a nice, crisp, clear, concise recapitulation of what happened, but not every word, because those kinds of conversations get touched off. I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. I sound stupid. Can we take that off? All those kinds of things. So you want to keep your minutes concise, and that'll eliminate another issue going forward.
But reply all can be a can of worms because it does then invite other people to
Right.
continue a discussion on that thread.
Again, if you're going to do that, maybe at the front of it, Jill, you say, do not reply all. I want you all to see this, but let's talk about it at the meeting. That's probably the best way to handle that.
Thank you.
Joanne?
Can the recorded minutes substitute for written minutes?
No, the written minutes are still required.
Is it sufficient in the minutes simply to have a recording only of the motions made and no description of the discussion?
Technically, Joanne, yes. Technically, for better or for worse, the only requirement in minutes, legal requirement, is a record of who votes for what or for whom. So, other than that, it's what you want to put in them. And so technically, yes, that would be enough.
Thank you.
Sure. Do we see anybody else, John?
Anyone? Going once? Going twice? I think that's it.
Okay, well, listen, folks, again, I'm gonna probably have to jump off. It's getting dark out in the hallway there. Thank you for your time. Pearlie and Gordon, with apologies, I'm gonna jump off. Remember, if you need anything, what's gonna happen is once I disappear, you're gonna say, oh, I should have asked. Do not hesitate to pick up the phone and call. Happy to try to help. And if I don't know an answer, I'll get you one. And it may not be what you wanted to hear, but remember, it's not an order. It's just advice, and you can mold it into your next course of action very easily. So with that, guys, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for being so
Thank you,
concise.
Tom.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Okay, so that's a great presentation by Tom. And now we have Attorney Pearlie Grimes to talk about public meetings. From his perspective, he has been counsel to the town of Cornwall for over 30 years and has actively represented us and other municipalities in court, and is a great source of advice. So, Pearlie, thank you.
Thank you for having me, Gordon. I just want to indicate that it's been a pleasure serving as town council for the town of Cornwall. I look forward to the meetings that you have, and I'm always impressed with the intelligence and interest of the citizens of Cornwall in all these matters. What I would like to do is just briefly address the issues relative to your regulations and some concerns that I see from time to time, and then answer any questions that you might have relative to those concerns or anything else that you care to ask. The touchstone for all zoning commission members is the regulations. There's nothing more valuable in the use of a member's time than knowing the regulations and knowing them well, because that makes your meetings much more productive. And I even suggest from time to time to individuals when they ask, bring your copy of your regulations to the meeting, because I often find that at the meetings, someone will say, well, where is that? Or I don't think so. That really doesn't say that. And the easiest way to have an effective meeting is to all agree that we looked at it and we find that in fact, it is the regulation as was quoted by the one individual. The idea is to try to be efficient when you get into these meetings. And so you can discharge your duties to the public to superintend the land use affairs relative to zoning for the town. The simplest place to start always is with the table of contents, because the table of contents is the map that shows where your regulations go. And the regulations themselves are detailed, but in general, your regulations only say what is allowed. If there is no permission to have a massage parlor in Cornwall, then a massage parlor is prohibited. Your regulations are called what is permissive regulations, which is a little bit of an anomaly, because if it's permitted, it's permitted. But the bottom line is you must find the touchstone for the use within the regulations. And then, of course, your Article 3 describes what uses are available in each zone. And those uses are either as of right, or they are special exception uses. And the other thing that I find interesting is that there's usually a very good message in the definitions page of your regulations. If you look at the regulations, they have definitions of everything that is of concern, and oftentimes it solves the problem. So if you familiarize yourself with these regulations and also with your POCAD, you will be able to effectively superintend the zoning affairs of the town when you meet. Remember, however, that the POCAD does not have the strength of the regulations themselves. The POCAD is only a guideline and suggested as to what should be accomplished. It should be consulted by the commission, but it is not as strong as the regulation itself. The POCAD is in effect the source of some of your regulations. The issue of public meetings I have found to be somewhat different from town to town. The most effective public meetings are those where the chairman has control and the members take their cue from the chairman. I have seen members of commissions, unfortunately, start talking in the middle of an application or in the middle of a discussion of an item about, oh, well, yeah, that reminds me of this. Oh, yeah, I had that at this time. Or, oh, no, that's foolish. I think, as Tom Hennick pointed out, these meetings, since they're open to the public, they show the temperament of the individuals that are there. And in order to become a very active member and an effective member, you need to consider your words when you're there. So the members should be careful. They should review the agenda in advance of the meeting. They should familiarize themselves with anything that is on the agenda. So in general, they might want to look at the prior minutes, if in fact there were prior minutes on the subject and it's going forward. And then in terms of the minutes themselves, the public needs to be able to rely on those minutes. And as Tom said, the key is the concise action that was taken. You do not have to record, I should say, ad nauseum, the various reasons that may or may not pertain in a decision. You make the decision, and unless the statutes say otherwise, you don't have to state the reasons. There are oftentimes sections that the statutes require that the reasons be stated. If that is the case and you're in that situation, it is wise to speak with your ZEO and have the ZEO perhaps draft some reasons for consideration. And one of the things that they could draft is alternate motions, a motion to approve or a motion to deny with reasons if needed. So that is something that you really ought to consider. And I think that will make your job easier, and it will make the results a little more direct and non-problematic. So I do think that you should be ready to vote on the minutes when you arrive. The reason that you should do that is because they are, in effect, your action. And they may be, these minutes may be, they usually are, the first part of the record in any proceeding that questions the activity taken by the commission. The first thing they'll ask for is, where are the minutes? Where's the agenda? And where's the minutes of that evening? So you want to have the minutes as concise and as direct as possible. And I would reiterate that I think you should try to avoid any sidebar comments or social comments during the meeting. I think you should try to stick to the agenda and inform yourself of that agenda and be ready to act on the agenda when you get to the meeting. Now, there is, as Tom Hennick alluded to, a problem if there are what we call ex parte communications. What are ex parte communications? They are communications that take place between a member of the public and a member of a board or commission relative to a topic that's being considered. So if you are in that grocery store and you see someone and they say, I want to talk to you about the new regulation that is going into effect, the commission member is well advised to say, well, I'm glad you're interested. Please come to the next meeting, which is on thus and such a date at this location or a hybrid, and you will understand all about it. But you do not want to have that conversation with an interested person outside of the meeting itself, or it could be problematic. So my suggestion would be that if the person is adamant, you should just simply say, we have been advised that it's not wise for us to do that. And why would that be? Because if someone said that they were discussing it with you and that you told them thus and such, and then when you got to the meeting, it didn't come out that way, then they would be concerned perhaps, and it would be something that might come out in the course of any proceedings that follow, such as an appeal or an action to enforce an alleged violation. So be very careful about ex parte communications. That is especially so when you're in the middle of a public hearing. And the reason for that is that a public hearing is required to have a record. And the record is required to be the baseline for the appeal if an appeal is brought. And so you want to be sure that the record is complete and doesn't contain anything that is untoward as far as the commission is concerned. It would be a case of possible liability to the commission if in fact there were these discussions which were ex parte, to the extent that the court could rule on appeal that the ex parte communications so tainted the process and the record that the appeal is either sustained or reversed, depending upon which side brought the appeal. So be careful about that. The other thing that I always see and hear a lot about is that there's a conflict of interest. What is a conflict of interest? The statute defines a conflict of interest as a personal or financial interest in the matter being discussed. So if Mrs. Jones is there and she's a commission member, and her son is coming in for a gas station license or something else, she should clearly disqualify herself and recuse herself and not participate in that hearing at all on her son's application. Similarly, if there is a business and the business is an active business and it comes before you with one of its members saying, this is the XYZ LLC company and I'm the managing member and there are two other members and one of those members sits on the commission, then obviously I think that member should say, I'm going to recuse myself from that. So I believe that it would be inappropriate if there was not a recusal under either the personal situation in the first instance or the financial situation in the second instance, where the individual was looking for a benefit to his particular business. So that's one issue we see. Another issue that comes up as a criticism, I should say, of an appeal is that there is a bias or prejudice of a certain member. Now, how does that usually come up? Again, it would usually come up because someone would have a recording or a transcript of the hearing or meeting, for that matter, and they would hear the person say words to the effect that, I don't care how many protections are put in for this massage parlor. There is no way I will vote for it in any form. That is bias or prejudice in advance. And that person's vote may be declared invalid by the court because of bias or prejudice. Similar to that is the area of prejudgment. And prejudgment oftentimes is a little bit less apparent, but prejudgment arises in the form of oftentimes an individual saying, well, we're discussing all these conditions here, but I've been looking at these conditions and I've seen around town that shrubs and fences and all of that don't do the job. They're ineffective. So as far as I'm concerned, while we can impose conditions which the regulations allow, I'm not in favor of conditions. So that's prejudgment. And if you think about that, we're trying to be fair to the public who come before the board or commission. And if in a certain instance, one of the applicants needs to request buffering or fencing or whatever, then that person would be able to say to the court on appeal that this particular member had prejudged conditions, and so that vote should be removed from the count. The point of these issues relative to conflict of interest and bias or prejudice and prejudgment and the issue of ex parte communications is, as Tom Hennick said, you are public officials and you have an obligation as public officials to carry out the public trust, which has been placed in your hands in the form of your zoning regulations. And it's critical for the operation of the town that each member be fair and impartial to the applicant in all matters that come before them. Now, there's also a question as to the type of matters and the amount of discretion that individuals have in those matters. There are basically three types of matters that come before you. And this would be either at a meeting or at a public hearing. The first type is an administrative decision that you have to make. And what does that involve? That involves a regulation that says you must apply for a site plan, and the site plan can be looked at and can be determined by either the CEO and or the commission. In that case, that is a 100% administrative function. You go down the site plan requirements in your regulations, you look at each one, you check each one off, and if they've met all the requirements of the site plan, an administrative decision and no special exception is required, then they get the approval and you don't have any discretion on a site plan application. If, however, there is a category where there is some discretion, it normally would be in the area of special exceptions. Special exceptions are just that. They are special changes that are allowed, provided that your commission finds that it's in the best interests to allow a certain variation for a hotel or a school in a residential zone or other special exception uses. In that case, there is, as you know, a whole set of regulations that deal with that particular special exception, and then the general standards for special exceptions. And your discretion is found in either one of those two places, either in the general standards for special exceptions, which talks about the compatibility with the neighborhood, et cetera, or in the special regulations, which talk about no lighting after certain hours for an activity or a playground or something of that nature. So in that time, in those cases, it is very critical that you recognize where your discretion is. And if you have discretion, you should exercise it in what you consider to be the best interests of the town. The last item on the matter list is the question of amendments, both to the zoning map and to the regulations themselves. amendments vest the most discretion in the commission. Amendments have been characterized as giving very broad discretion to commission members. You should keep that in mind because it is important to understand that you have been placed in this position of clarifying regulations, amending regulations, talking about zones, changing zones, and that's a public trust. It lays out how the town of Cornwall is going to grow in the future. And I think you can all think about towns that perhaps you feel might not have gone in the right direction, and as a result are not in the proper status to be called a town that is as welcoming as Cornwall. So I would just say that if you keep that in mind, there are non-discretionary site plan applications, there are partial discretionary special exception applications, and there's broad discretion amendments. You will find that that will very much serve your purposes, and you will not be subject to criticism as long as you follow those rules. The key thing to remember for commission members is that what happens if there's an appeal? What happens is the court looks at the record. It decides whether on the basis of the record, the decision was made properly or not. There is a long-standing principle in the case law that says that the court will not substitute its discretion for the discretion validly exercised by the commission. So the court is not going to say, well, I don't see it that way. I think I would have changed the amendment in a different fashion. The court is not in that position. The court simply needs to believe and find in the record that there is substantial evidence to support the decision made by the commission. That's all it has to find. And if it finds that there is substantial evidence in the record, then that's the end of the discussion. And it's only if there is, you will see some complaints that talk about an abuse of discretion. It's only if there's an abuse of discretion by the commission that the court wants to hear about what issues are deemed to be the abuse according to the appellant. So your decisions are critical, but they have a certain insularity because the court is not going to second guess you. Now, there has been discussion also from time to time in various forums about the enforceability of your regulations and how can we enforce these regulations and how do we know if we grant this permit that he won't do something outside the permit. Well, it's really critical to understand that, as someone once said, there's no guarantees in life. And so therefore, a person with an application who gets approval can decide he's not going to follow the approval. He's going to try to expand it. If that happens, it becomes an enforcement issue. And how does the enforcement get done? The community creates a record to show that they went to the ZEO in the first instance and complained. The ZEO has the obligation to refer the matter to the commission itself, and the commission can then decide what to do. And then can seek enforcement and penalties and enjoin any action that is not approved. So I do think that you need to keep that in mind. The other thing to remember is if a zoning enforcement officer or the commission makes a decision, its decision can be appealed not to the court. There's no public hearing on this one. If it's just a meeting and a person walks into the zoning office and gets a permit, that's a decision by the zoning officer. Any person can appeal that decision by the zoning officer, or similarly, any decision by the commission itself, to the ZBA. what happens then? The ZBA calls a meeting and has not a question, it's not a question of variance, which ZBA is charged to enforce, but it's a question of, did the enforcement officer or the commission make the right decision? And at that point, the person that is chagrined by the result will try to present a record to show why that decision should be overturned. And that decision will go on the record of the ZBA. And if in fact the ZBA upholds the decision, that person has a right to take a further appeal from the ZBA to the court. Most of the times, if the ZBA upholds the decision of the commission or the enforcement officer, in my experience, that's the end of the road in terms of the appeal. So I do think that you also need to keep in mind that there's a statute that says that there's a 30-day time limit on any individual bringing a notice of a violation or a claim notice of a violation to the ZBA. That's 30 days from the date that the applicant posts the decision, if he publishes it in the newspaper himself, or 30 days before the individual becomes aware of it, which is called constructive notice. So if there's the famous case of the person who watches while a structure goes up within the boundary lines and doesn't do anything for a period of time, that person may be out on the question of going to the ZBA. So if you want to strictly enforce your regulations, everyone should be aware in your community that they do have a right on those decisions to go to the ZBA. That's as much as I have to say at the present time, other than to compliment all volunteers and all members of the public who are interested in their town on spending the time and doing the work to become an effective commission member and an effective participant and citizen in the community. I think the more involvement there is in the community, the healthier the community. So you're to be all credited for that, and as Cornwall has a long history of participation by its members. I think that's about a half an hour for me, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that any of you have.
James?
Yeah, thanks, Pearlie. I had a question for a commission member. If say a neighbor has an application, and obviously I would think that that commission member would then recuse themselves for that application. However, if it's something that obviously they would have a vested interest in because they're a neighbor, could they still participate as a figure of the public and still question the applicant, or should they just remove themselves entirely from the room, if you will, and not partake at all?
My advice to people, members who recuse themselves for any reason, is let the recusal stand and speak for itself, and do not get involved in the actual discussion. That would be my advice. That's one of the shortcomings or one of the limitations that you accept when you become a commission member.
Especially in a small town like Cornwall. Yeah.
True.
Thanks.
Yep.
Joanne?
Pearlie, it seems to me that your entire presentation was an extremely interesting argument or proposal that Cornwall might consider going back to what we had prior to 1967. Because everything that you're focused on and concerned about as we look to the possibility of appeal of decisions, has to do with the zoning part. But in fact, all of those things frustrate any effective participation by the citizens in planning. So how would you respond to the idea of Cornwall returning to the idea of separate, which many towns I understand do have, separate planning and separate zoning? Because when you have the constraints of zoning in meetings, it really eliminates public participation and interaction. So what do you think about those towns that have separated the two? And what would you think about Cornwall returning to that?
I would say in the first instance that the majority of towns have both functions in one commission.
Yeah, well.
And I think you've probably looked at that, Joanne, and probably have the numbers. But my thought is that it is more efficient to have a combined commission. That's my thought, because you're all in the room together and you can all, whether it's the planning function or the administrative function, you can do your work. There are several commissions that set aside one of their regular meetings for a planning session and the other regular meeting for the business section of their work. That might be something that could be explored. But I don't think that to separate the two commissions is going to be efficient in terms of the communication between the two separate commissions relative to land use issues as to the size of the residential lots or any other requirements that you wanted to consider in the planning mode. If there's a valid issue of planning, I think it should be brought up to the attention of the commission and let the commission address the concern relative to planning.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Certainly.
My concern, well, if we go to the model that you just described, would you encourage the Planning and Zoning Commission to have perhaps some different rules of engagement? Because right now we are faced with the situation where our only remedy is the next election in terms of participation. Says right on the planning and zoning agenda that we can write in our questions, but they will be answered if appropriate. So we as citizens are really put in the position of, waiting till the next election to have any real interaction with our Planning and Zoning Commission. And especially with the things that you outlined, where the board has to protect itself and protect the community with the decisions that they make. So where do we as citizens get our questions answered? Where do we participate?
You participate by writing letters to the commission and asking.
They don't have to answer, they say that.
I understand, but we want to think about being neighborly, and we want to think about comity, and we want to think about reasonableness on all these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we don't want this commission, which has an important function, to be sidetracked by personal issues or personal thoughts that are not really related to planning or zoning. So I think that's what you have in place now. And as far as I can see, in Cornwall, it's worked very well.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean about it working well for the citizen who brings up a real question, not a personal issue. We've lost the dialogue opportunity. How is that restored by keeping the two together?
Well, one of the things that commissions often do is they have forums or workshops on the issue of do we want more commerce in the town, or do we want to expand the local commercial district? And we have a discussion, much as you would have a discussion in a forum when you're looking at the POCAD. And you have those POCAD discussions and everyone is invited. And there's not going to be any decision to be made at that time, but everyone is invited to bring their own opinion there for consideration on the topic that's being discussed in the forum. So I think
We've done that. We did that. We put our POCAD together. We all participated. We went to those meetings, but now we have a planning and zoning commission that's talking about major changes to our zoning rules. And I'm just trying to find a way that you can help our planning and zoning commission find a way to invite public input without considering it. Well, you talked about efficiency. You know, democracy isn't always efficient. That's a concern for many of us.
I understand, but on the other hand, it is a public trust, and it cannot, the role of the member cannot be diminished over time by constant rehashing of issues that are maybe of importance to the individual.
Thank you for engaging in a conversation back and forth. I wish we could have more of that at P&Z. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask one question?
Certainly.
Oh, it's Carolyn Nastro. I was just wondering, when you were consulted, when they did the P&Z, the chair of the P&Z commission said that you were consulted before they passed the home business regulations. And there was a question of concern that was raised regarding whether the commission had the authority to recategorize a minor business application as requiring a special permit or a special exception. And you said in the letter before the regulations were adopted on July 3rd that they did not have that authority. However, they had said that they consulted you prior to that. During the public hearing, the chair said that she consulted you about the regulations, and they based their decision, or the commission stated that at the public hearing, that they felt that they could pass the regulations and they wouldn't do harm to a residential neighborhood because they would be allowed, if they encountered a business that might have the potential to cause noise or pollution, that they would be allowed then to require that minor home business to go through the special permit process. So I just was confused because they had said they consulted you about that and you gave them that advice. But then the letter that you wrote on June 21st, it said that that wasn't the case. So if you could just clarify which one is accurate.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, ma'am.
Sorry, it's Carolyn Nastro.
Ms. Nastro, as you know, I'm an attorney, and as you know, I have clients. And in this case, my clients were the members of the Planning and Zoning Commission in Cornwall. And so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to get involved in a dialogue as to the information that I provided and when did I provide it. You know, because you've seen my letter, what my conclusion was. And that to me is a sufficient answer to your question.
So your conclusion being not what the commission conveyed as your conclusion in the hearing, but what was in your June 21st letter, you mean?
I'm not going to characterize what the commission said. I'm not going to get involved in that because that's not part of my job.
Could you say what your conclusion was then in that letter, if that was the right one?
Well, I wouldn't have given the opinion in the letter if I didn't think it was the right decision.
Okay. So basically the commission doesn't have the authority to recharacterize a minor home business as requiring a special home permit, as was portrayed to us in the commission during the public hearing.
Well, you're asking me to say yes or no to a question, and I don't know whether the underlying facts that you put up there are accurate.
So if the commission did say that during the basically you're basically said that, if I interpreted it right, that you cannot recategorize a minor home business. You can't have it go through the special permit process if it satisfies the criteria of a minor home business. Would you say that's right?
I would say that the letter speaks for itself, and it was talking about a site plan application. And the rule is that if the regulations regarding site plan are met, as I said earlier in my remarks, then there's no administrative discretion.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Leela? Just joking. You don't have to say anything. I just like putting you on the spot. Sorry. Anyone else?
That's all right. I was searching for my unmute button so that I could acknowledge it. So now I'll go back on mute.
Good to see you.
Okay, if we don't hear any more questions, then we will wrap this up. And again, thanks, Pearlie. I don't think other towns invite their attorney to public forums, and I appreciate your efforts to educate us as we go forward. These are complicated issues, procedures, and again, trying to educate ourselves on going forward as a lot of these situations vary. And it's a lot of work to understand the procedures and the requirements. So again, thank you for participating in trying to illuminate us and on what the proper procedures are. So again, thank everybody for joining, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
And thank you for the opportunity, Gordon.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, take care. Good night, everyone.
Thanks,
night.
Shirley.
You're welcome.